I'm back. Mr. Clarke's back. Time to take a look at 15.6, the modernization of Japan. Some of the key objectives that we're looking at here as we move forward, we'll look at the problems that Tokugawa Japan faced. We'll look at how the United States opened Japan to the outside world. We'll analyze the causes and effects of the Meiji Restoration. We'll describe how Japan began to build an empire. Okay, question one. What did the Japanese emphasize for centuries in Japan? Tradition, samurai with swords, weapons that could have been used in centuries past, even when they got into a more modern period of time. Samurais continued to carry their samurai sword. And traditions over the course of time, very similar to what we had seen with China, began to limit them a little bit there in terms of comparison to other Western countries. If they weren't modernizing, they were going to fall behind. What did the Tokugawa shoguns do after seizing control of Japan in the 1600s? They reimposed central feudalism. Feudalism is like a hierarchical system where you have basically the lords and the knights. In this case here, it would be samurai warriors. And then you have the people who worked the land. And very similar there, kind of tiered system that we saw in feudal Europe. They closed Japan to foreigners as they wanted to continue a homogeneous society, meaning that they didn't really want any outside influences, and they outlawed Japanese travel overseas. Three, how much interaction did Japan have with the world from the 1600s through the 1800s? Well, they pretty much developed in isolation. They did not have much interaction whatsoever with other countries. Okay, question 4. List the major causes and effects and decline of Tokugawa Japan. Causes of the decline: economic strains and isolationism. The United States forced Japan to open up to the West for trade. The West forced unequal treaties on Japan. The United States and European nations insist on extraterritoriality and low taxes for imports. Effects: the samurai and daimyo lack money. The Japanese blame the shogun and daimyo and samurai place. Samurai, that's too many ands there. And samurai place emperor in charge. Okay, why did the situation in China with the Opium War alarm Japanese leaders? Well, their fear would be that Japan would be the next victim of Western powers who might continue their imperialistic activities in Japan and kind of bully the Japanese into surrender. 6, what did the United States do in July of 1853 in an attempt to open up trade with Japan? You can see the imagery there in the painting. The United States sent a fleet of naval ships under the command of my friend and your friend, Commodore Matthew Perry, to Tokyo Bay. This was a letter from the American president at the time, Franklin Pierce, who demanded that Japan open up its ports to American trade. 7, why do you think the United States approached Japan in this way, kind of demanding and bullying the Japanese to open up trade? The United States knew Japan would be intimidated by the military, and if you look back at that imagery, you can see the small Japanese boats versus the large American naval ships. Because of the intimidation factor, the United States figured the Japanese would kind of give in. And since the United States leaders wanted to expand trade immediately, quite possibly before other Western nations could get in there, they made their demand instead of a request. Okay, number 8, explain the terms of the Treaty of Kananagua. Japan had no choice but to give in to U.S. demands, as the treaty gave the United States access to 2 Japanese ports, which was very important. Soon thereafter, the United States gained trading rights and a most favored nation clause with Japan. Nine. What did the unhappiness in Japan towards foreign influences lead to? It led to a revolt. This unseated the shogun and restored the 15-year-old emperor back to power. What was the Meiji Restoration? It took place from 1868 to 1912. The Meiji Enlightened rule transformed Japan. They decided to completely alter traditional social fabric and kind of make Japan a modern nation state and a competitive empire. So they, more so than the Chinese or the Russians, they actually were the first country in that region of the world to really modernize. So they're going to take a step forward while the other nations are still kind of caught in more traditional ways of life and not really a modern country yet. Eleven. How did Japan's adaptation to Western ways help balance its relationship with Western countries? By studying and adapting Western ways and culture, the modernized Japan more quickly. As they were modernizing more quickly, they were in a better position to kind of deal with Western demands. 12, what model did the Japanese follow as they wrote a new constitution? They followed the Western democracy of Germany. 13, compare and contrast Japan. Compare and contrast Japan before and during the Meiji Restoration. Before the Japanese and the Meiji Restoration had the feudal system that we alluded to earlier. They were isolated from other countries, had very limited trade, poor leadership, and they faced a lot of corruption. It valued its cultural traditions and it did not look to other countries for ideas. During the Meiji Restoration, Japan quickly adopted Western styles and traditions and transformed the Japanese government, built up their new technologies, education. 14, what did the Meiji Constitution establish in 1889? All citizens under the law. Emperor retained the autocratic power. Japanese legislature was split in two. The upper house, which was appointed by the emperor, and the lower house elected by the people. Very similar to, let's say, even in the British Parliament, the House of Lords and House of Commons. In Germany, the Bundesrat and the Reichstag. They created federal departments, just like we have in the United States, departments of military, education, finance, things like that. In order to see their economy get better linked together and really develop a vibrant economy, they came up with an organized banking system and a more organized system of commerce and money. Transportation improvements included railways and roadways and ports. Communication-wise, they had a telegraph system and a postal system put into effect. What evidence supports the claim that Japan successfully updated its industries during the Meiji Restoration? Modern equipment and machinery helped increase Japanese silk production. The Japanese also had successful shipyards, copper and coal mining, as well as steel. During the Meiji Restoration, number 17, many changes were made to the hierarchical class system in Japan. What inequalities remained? Women were still unequal. They were not allowed to participate in the political system. The Constitution outlawed legal class distinctions, but differences still remained amongst the classes. 18, why is Japan considered a homogeneous society? The Japanese share a common culture, language, and a strong sense of identity. And to this day, it's very difficult to break the homogeneous society in Japan. There are obviously outsiders who do live in Japan, but still it's a predominantly homogeneous society, meaning people of Japanese descent. This has helped them to become one of the world's most powerful and successful nations, today obviously an economic power. 19, did Japan have a strong military in the 1890s? Indeed, they did, strong enough to begin its own imperial empire and to force Western countries to begin to reverse some of the unequal treaty systems. Historically, back then and even today, why does Japan lack many natural resources it needed for industrial growing empire? Well, Japan was formed through volcanic activity, and much of Japan is hardened soil from volcanic rock, and therefore they don't have a lot of the resources like we have here in the United States, and therefore they had to look outside of Japan to obtain resources for their developing industries. 21, what were the events of the Sino-Japanese War? This means the Chinese-Japanese War. In 1894, war broke out between Japan and China as they competed for control in Asia. To the surprise of the Chinese and the West, Japan easily defeated a much larger country, China. Japan gained control of Taiwan and some treaty ports in China. See some of the fighting ongoing here between the Chinese and the Japanese. Then the Japanese got involved in another war against a big power, the Russo-Japanese War, or the war with Japan and Russia. Japan attacked Russian ships off the coast of Manchuria in February of 1904. Russian naval reinforcements were soundly defeated in 1905. United States president, one of the best presidents in the history of the United States of America, Theodore Roosevelt, helped to negotiate the Treaty of Portsmouth in New Hampshire within the United States. It gave Japan control of Korea as well as rights in parts of Manchuria. Japan had truly emerged as a world power. You can see in the cartoon here, Theodore Roosevelt in the center, the Russian, in that case there, I guess, representing the Tsar, probably Tsar Nicholas II at that point in time, of course. And then we have here the Japanese, you see the Japan on the shield, and he had negotiated peace between the two countries. Compare and contrast how Japan and Korea dealt with imperialist ambitions of other countries. Japan accepted Western trade. Korea, they suffered unequal treaties with its trading partners for a long period of time, and as Japan modernized its economy, it began to expand and began to compete. Korea, which had been a closed society like Japan, faced domination from stronger neighbors such as Russia, China, and Japan. So Korea did not modernize, so therefore they were continuing to get bullied. Whereas Japan, who had modernized, could now defend themselves a little more easily. By 24, how did Japan gain rule over Korea? Japan looked to Korea for raw materials, and after defeating China in the First Sino-Japanese War, Japan defeated Russia, and now they were bullying and doing what they wished with Korea, making Korea a protectorate under their harsh rule. And finally, the lesson reflection, the United States of America is not a homogeneous society. What are the pros and cons of being a heterogeneous society, meaning a much more diverse country? The United States is pretty much a melting pot of the world. This is a blend of many, many different cultures. It's great to get to know and understand different cultures and languages. Some argue, however, that it breaks down American traditions when people fail to assimilate. We have modern day issues of refugees and illegal immigrants into the country that have to be dealt with. And of course, you have terroristic threats. Anytime somebody could cross the border without detection. That'll conclude our discussions here on Japan. And until next time, Mr. Clarke is out.